Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet more Warhammer 40k lore. But today we are going to talk about the Dark Eldar Navy, the Drukhari fleet. Its ships, its weapons, its defenses, its organizational structure, or lack thereof, and its role within the Dark Eldar pirate empire. And, of course, we'll touch upon its role in raids and planetary invasions too. I already did a video on Dark Eldar planetary invasions like 5 years ago, God help me. So we won't go too deeply into it, but obviously the fleet plays a very important part in bringing the Drukhari to their victims. Although the Dark Eldar very rarely invade anything to hold it, of course, because, well, all that would achieve is make them stationary targets. Besides, what would they do with the planet anyways? Commorragh is literally the infinite city. They've got plenty of space, and as for mineral resources or agricultural riches, the Dark Eldar simply just steal those anyways, so they're not going to be grubbing about in the ground for them themselves. Now are they? Of course not. So, the Dark Eldar Navy is unlike pretty much any other major fleet force in the 41st millennium, in that it has no centrally organized hierarchy or command structure or, well, charter at all. It wouldn't be going too far to say that there is no such thing as a Drukhari navy. This despite the fact that it is, of course, of tremendous import to the Dark Eldar. Without the Navy, they couldn't raid real space. Without the ability to raid into real space, Commorragh would swiftly wither and die on the vine. You would thus think that a maintenance of a well-organized, properly maintained and crewed fleet would be of paramount importance to the entire faction, as it forms not just the foundations, but pretty much the entirety of their economy. And yes, that's true, but you see, there is one tiny little bit of a problem there. If the Drukhari had a centrally organized navy, it would have to be under the command of a Dark Eldar. And the Dark Eldar themselves have a pronounced and thoroughly justified distrust of every single solitary other member of their own kind. Thus, an official Dark Eldar fleet sounds like a pretty damn terrible idea to everyone. The closest that the Drukhari come to a proper national navy is that of the Cabal of the Black Heart, under the command of Asdrubael Vect himself, the King of Commorragh. But even then, this is only an official navy, insofar as it is the defense force of Vect's holding, which just so happens to be Commorragh. Now, I'm sure that it has occurred to Vect on more than one occasion that being in command of the Dark Eldar's principal and damn near sole proper port might give him a monopoly of a fleet power as well. After all, what's a warship without a port to return to? But again, considering how literally vital the existence and the operation of the fleet is for the very existence of the Dark Eldar as a species, this is the one thing even Vect dares not do, as it would see every enemy he's ever made, and his friends as well, friend in the Dark Eldar sense, unify against him immediately, and with an unshakable common purpose. Thus, instead, the Cabals are allowed to maintain their own fleets of warships, so long as they pay tribute, of course, to the master of the port. Obviously. There is no hard limitations on the size of a fleet that a Cabal is capable of having either. Indeed, some major Cabals have next to no presence on Commorragh itself, beyond the interests of its fleet arm, and conducts business with the other cabals primarily as a means of transportation or cooperation to bring other, more specialized ground-pounding cabals to their targets. This is as much by necessity as design, as, again, Dark Eldar society tends to be quite vicious, and any force that grows too large, even the Cabal of the Black Heart, is swiftly going to find itself with a resplendent number of daggers in its back. Thus, even for a major fleet power, it's important to not step on too many toes. And besides, these big boys are few and far between. The overwhelming majority of Dark Eldar cabals will be very lucky indeed to operate a single vessel or a small squadron, never mind something that could be confused for a fleet. Because, of course, the purchase, the maintenance, and the operation of a void-faring warship is ruinously expensive, as even the smallest ship commonly operated by the Drukhari, the ubiquitous Corsair-class escort, is over a kilometre long, with crews numbering in the hundreds and a very large boarding detachment as well. Many a cabal has no doubt ruined itself trying to maintain its own warship, and in most cases, a real space raid is a collaborative effort between several cabals, or even one large cabal that essentially provides infrastructure and support, and then hires volunteers, quote-unquote, from the more than eager population of Commorragh to carry out the actual fighting, in return for a slice of the overall profits. But of course, the profits, too, can be enormous. As mentioned, Commorragh exists solely due to repeated real space raid, meaning that anything and everything these raids bring back home is going to be sold at a premium. This is why every cabal's most dearly held wish is to be able to launch its own solo real space raids into the material universe, so that they can keep all of those goody-good profits for themselves. The road to getting there, of course, is a long and thorny one, and begins, most often, with, well, the Corsair-class escort. So, let's have a bit of a closer look at this ship, shall we? Or more correctly, this general classification of warship. For Corsair class does not necessarily indicate a specific type of warship, but more correctly so a displacement of roughly 1 to 1.5 kilometer and 4 to 5 megatons. A good starting boat for an ambitious cabal. Not too big, not too small, and very customizable. As mentioned, these ships can vary quite considerably. Some of them may have full-on shielding system in the form of shadow fields. Now, the shadow field is an interesting piece of technology, which we may as well address now, that creates not an energy shield around the ship, but rather a energy-absorbing haze, created by a mysterious material mined from the foundations of the universe. No, I'm not kidding. And that should give you some indication also as to the cost of acquiring such a shielding device as well. Now, it is also available in personal formats as personal shields, where they are nigh on impenetrable to most conventional weaponry. But in the void, well, even frigates pack cannons that can blow craters into planets a few hundred meters wide, so the scale of destruction is on an entirely different level. In the Void, the Shadow Field will be able to soak up some punishment, but its first and most important duty is to baffle the sensors of enemy vessels, as the fog-like substance with which it shrouds the ship not only protects it, but also impairs enemy targeting softwares, auger arrays, and active measures, making it very difficult for hostile warships to get a solid weapons lock and bearing on the Corsair. This is of course vitally important because Void warfare usually takes place over tens of thousands of kilometers between combatants moving hundreds if not thousands of meters per second. Thus, of course, being able to judge the precise range to target and its relative velocity compared to yours is crucial. And damn near any margin of error is too much, which is precisely what the Drukhari is counting on, so that they can get in close enough to preferably disable their target vessel, rather than destroy it. Because, as funny as it is to see the silly monkey flail about in the Void, it's not very profitable to blow up your own slaves. But what to do about the fact that the slaves tend to be trying to blow you up? Very unsporting of them. Well, not getting hit is of course one solution, but it is not the perfect solution. As a very wise man once said, the best way not to die is to not be seen, then not to be hit, and finally to survive being hit. This is where a second piece of very popular technology comes into play, the Mimic engine. As the name indicates, this is a piece of Drukhari technology that somehow, through arcane technological means, changes the vessel's signature. And by signature, we mean how the ship appears on enemy auger arrays. Now, this will be a combination of visual observation, if you're relatively close in, space terms, the shape of the target on radar, the Auspex contact itself, as well as all emissions that come out of the vessel. The overwhelming majority of spaceships are constantly radiating all manners of information. Even something simple like a radar functions by sending out radar waves, an emission. Even something as minuscule as a ship's heat, generated of course by its engines, internal functions, or hell, even by the crew, will eventually suffuse the ship and begin radiating outwards. And any major operations like running thrusters or arming weaponry, etc., all of these things can potentially be detected and interpreted by an enemy. Of course, there are ways to try and get around this to minimize a vessel's signature in the Void, by minimizing power expenditure, by keeping the engines throttled down, by keeping weapons offline, etc., etc., etc. But better yet would be the ability to actually fake those emissions, which is what the Mimic engine does. Say, for example, that our ambitious little cabal is raiding Imperial shipping lanes. Now, any Imperial mass transport that detects a oddly sleek and very fast ship vectoring directly towards them is going to start shouting for help as loudly as it can. And in the case of more hostile contacts, like a patrol of Imperial frigates or destroyers, they will of course be actively scanning the Void around them to detect just such interlopers. But neither one is likely to cast a second glance at a small Imperial freighter, making its way between the predetermined trade routes between planets. There are thousands of such ships throughout the Imperium, traveling on real space drives without the benefit of warp technology. They accelerate as fast as they can towards their destination, and then when they're halfway there, they flip around and start decelerating just as fast. It is a vital part of Imperial commerce, but an agonizingly slow one, relatively speaking, and one that everyone mostly just ignores until they actually arrive at their destination, whether it be picking up or dropping off. Which is very handy for a small Drukhari warship, of course, as any closer scrutiny would quickly reveal that this thing doesn't move like one of these freighters. It doesn't match its speed, it doesn't decelerate or accelerate in the same way, and it certainly doesn't match its hull form, and neither is it pumping out any sort of identification beacon or anything like that either. But nobody cares, and so nobody checks, giving the Corsair an excellent opportunity to sneak up on its target. Hopefully, just in range of its Impaler assault module. This is another piece of very unique Drukhari tech. But whereas the Shadow Field functions on principles closer to magic than science, and the Mimic Drive is, well, high technology on a level completely incomprehensible to the average Imperial tech adept. And in sharp contrast to all of this, the assault module is a very simple piece of technology. It is a massively oversized boarding torpedo so large it must be carried externally on the Corsair. And its sole duty in life is to ramjet its way forward at maximum acceleration just below the level where the occupants would be turned into tomato paste and hammer its way into the opposing ship, whereupon it will disgorge its cargo of Cabal warriors. At which point it really doesn't matter if the target calls for help, as it will only be a very brief matter of time before the bridge is seized by them, and any distress signal can be hastily retracted with proffered apologies that it was clearly a mistake. People will say a lot of weird shit with a splinter rifle pointed to their heads, as it turns out. And by the time anyone gets nosy enough to investigate, the Dark Eldar will be long gone. At least, ideally speaking. The Corsair does also have a role to play in larger fleet engagements, but first and foremost it is an ambush predator. And if it gets itself into a stand-up fight, it's done something very wrong, and is likely to suffer a bevy of consequences because of it. Because it is not particularly heavily armed, nor is it particularly heavily armored either. All of its focus is going into the not get seen, or if seen, avoid getting hit part of the strategy. If even a frigate or a destroyer lands a solid hit on the Corsair, it's going to be a very sad ship indeed. That is not to say, however, that there aren't Corsairs created for the purpose of stand-up fights, but they are definitely rarer, and more often used as supporting vessels for other Corsairs rather than as individual raiders. This usually depends upon the proclivities of the Cabal in question. As mentioned, the Corsair is a very adaptable platform. There are those Cabals who mount Phantom Lancers on it, very heavy anti-ship weaponry. Others prefer to replace the assault modules with torpedo launchers, often carrying leech missiles, EMP warheads essentially, designed to literally leech the energy out of enemy ships' engines, defenses, and shields, leaving them stranded and helpless. The Corsair Escort, of course, also, as its name indicates, will often be used as a cheap an easy way to bring a serious firepower in the form of phantom lancers to bear at a very low cost, using the smaller vessels to protect much larger ones. But this is the operations of significantly larger cabals, or cooperative efforts between several cabals, rather than the raidings of a single small cabal. So let's instead look at the next step up when it comes to commonplace Drukhari warships, the Torture-class cruiser. Yet again, however, we are talking more about a range of displacement and type here rather than a specific class of warship, as it, much like the Corsair, is very adaptable to the whims and preferences of its owning cabal. It is significantly longer, however, usually something along the lines of 4 times as long, measuring in between 4 to 5 kilometers, and weighing in between 18 to 20 megatons. Unless a cabal gets very lucky and captures some supreme premium beef on their initial raiding runs, they are likely to take on multiple smaller Corsairs long before they even think about upgrading to one of these bad boys. So when the time comes, the Torture class is usually escorted by, well, Corsair escorts. At this point, we're starting to enter into the field of fleet-on-fleet combat. Or squadron-on-squadron, really, but potato-potato and all that. As a decent little fleet would be a Torture-class cruiser with 2 or 3 escorts, with the various units within the formation being specialized around certain tasks. Bearing in mind that, yet again, the most important aspect of an Eldar real space raid on a small scale like this is still not being detected by superior enemy forces. Now, a cruiser and 3 escorts, that's a sizable formation, and in most unpatrolled systems guarded merely by local defense forces, that will be more than enough to overcome pretty much any local force, made up of maybe a squadron of destroyers or frigates or something. Although, even if the Drukhari feel confident in their ability to attack and destroy such a force, they might not want to, because, bear you in mind here, the Drukhari take their own lives very seriously, and whenever you're engaging an enemy capable of shooting back, well, you are placing the most valuable of lives at risk, your own. And so while such a raiding force would be entirely capable of taking on small system defense forces, they'd probably still want to avoid it as much as possible, instead planting themselves opposite major trade lanes, where the Corsairs will still be doing most of the hunting, in pretty much precisely the same way as previously mentioned, with a potential exception for being able to take on multiple targets or using a mix of strategies, using leech torpedoes in combination with assault pods, for example, knocking out the point defenses of even the largest enemy freighter before boarding it with the assault module. And, crucially, now that they've got a cruiser backing them up, even should the hunting pack be interrupted by a group of sword-class frigates vectoring in on them, for example, the sword classes might see 3 enemy vessels raiding a trade lane and feel that that's even odds, squadron-on-squadron action, and sword-class captains tend to be of the aggressive sort. But if that squadron then begins detecting a cruiser-class displacement vessel closing in on the fight, they might realize that discretion is sometimes the better part of valor. Now, our little Drukhari raiding force is still going to have to step carefully around Imperial equivalent cruisers, as a Lunar class is more than capable of taking on a Torture class and hurting it badly, and again, the Dark Eldar are predators, They don't want to get hurt whilst chasing down their prey. In fact, doing so kind of defeats the entire purpose, and can thus be relatively easily dissuaded. But, of course, dedicating cruisers to guarding trade lanes is a major commitment on the behalf of the Imperial Navy, and one they may be willing to commit to if they're being struck by the Dark Eldar. But, well, remember the Mimic Drive? The Drukhari often use it to resemble not just, friendly ships, but other ships entirely, mimicking the crude drive signature of orc pirates, for example, will make the Imperial Navy think very, very differently about how to deal with these pirates than if they were Eldar. This confusion can, of course, then be well used by the Drukhari. Whilst the Imperials are busy searching nearby asteroid fields, favoured skulking spots for orc pirates, our little Cabal, meanwhile, simply sits in the middle of the void, shields up and virtually undetectable from anything but a close-range auger sweep. This can, of course, also be used for ambush tactics. If the Drukhari have located a particularly busy trade lane, but it's guarded, it might be worth the effort to try and take care of the guards. Launch a distracting attack, masking themselves as Chaos Raiders perhaps, lighter-style ships. Then, drawing the attention of the overzealous captain of the guard force, he races after the Chaos Intruders, expecting them to do what Chaos Pirates most often do, burn, pillage, and then run when faced with a greater military might. Seeing an opportunity for some glory, the Imperial Admiral gives chase after the small and floundering Chaos vessels. Their drives are clearly giving off signatures indicating that they are damaged, or simply, perhaps, badly maintained. He can catch them, and there's nothing around for miles. The void is empty. All the way up until the point where a broadside of Phantom Lancers impacts on the Lunar class's unshielded aft section. And that's a very big deal. See, the Dark Eldar's Phantom Lancers are a bit different from those of most other factions, in that they use antimatter technology, giving them well over twice the impact of Imperial and equivalent lance weaponry. So yeah, that first Alpha strike might very well cripple the prey immediately, particularly if guided by superior Eldar auspexes. If a Lunar class loses its engines, or even perhaps is gutted by a direct strike to its key core components, like the reactor, well, the remaining escorts will be easy prey, particularly now that they're in a panic after their lead vessel simply just evaporated. Of course, this is a riskier strategy, absolutely, but again, if the trade lane is wealthy enough, then taking care of the guard dogs might very well be worth it. Particularly as the next step up from trade lanes requires a far greater commitment. We're talking system holdings now, asteroid mining stations, for example, or indeed entire planets. These are going to be possessed of significantly greater defenses than your average merchant ship, of course, and is thus going to require a significantly greater dedication from the Drukhari in question. None but the absolute largest cabals could ever even consider launching a raid of this scale by themselves, so this is likely then to be a cooperative operation for our little example cabal. But if they're able to bring in a cruiser and a handful of escorts, that is a significant contribution, and they're likely to get a very, very good slice of the pie should they succeed. So let's take the step up to talk about actual full-scale fleet engagements, as if you're attacking a planet, you're likely to have to engage a fair few defenders. Now, in the case of outlaying worlds with maybe only a defense orbital or two, more often than not, the Eldar can simply sneak up on it and board it and or blast it into pieces if they have sufficient firepower. There are very few void bastions of true size and effectiveness in the Imperium of Man, you know, the kind that can take on entire fleets, and so in most cases a couple of cruisers will be more than enough to achieve near-space dominance. Indeed, in many worlds farther to the rear, where the Dark Eldar like to play, there's not even going to be that. Maybe a couple of local system defense craft, basically glorified freighters that somebody strapped a couple of guns to. Hell, Corsairs could do that job. The only reason they don't is because they can't carry enough men to carry all of the loot out from the planet with them. That, and it's always nice to have a nice big fat hangar for all of the assault craft, air superiority fighters, and bombers that you might want to bring with you on a more terrestrial campaign. As for larger ship classes, well, the Drukhari do have battleship displacement vessels, but they are exceptionally rare, and very little is known of them. They are, in essence, much larger cruisers. They're going to be equipped in much the same way, with leech torpedoes or scythe missiles, or, more commonly, masses of phantom lancers. They're more along the lines of pocket battleships or small battle cruisers, rather than actual Imperial-class battleships. These are not designed to stand in line, trading volleys with the enemy. They are designed to deliver as large an initial hit as possible, and then hopefully get the hell out of the way before retribution lands. They are also there to carry aforementioned various attack crafts. The Dark Eldar, due to their raiding nature, have quite the variety of these. The assault module that we've already talked about will kind of replace assault crafts in many vessels, but there are also things like the Slave Bringer Assault Boat, which are also defended by a miniaturized, simpler version of the Shadow Field, not capable of deflecting incoming fire with anywhere near the efficiency, but it does make it very, very difficult to actually hit and destroy. They also possess a fair few others as well, like space superiority fighters or bombers, but these won't serve a particularly niche role in the case of a major fleet action. They will simply serve as what their names indicate: fighters and bombers. Useful, absolutely, but nothing particularly exceptionally Dark Eldar-y about them. Meanwhile, things like the Slavebringer does deserve a little bit of a special mention, because the Dark Eldar are very good at boarding actions. Their incredible reflexes, along with their weaponry, which, again, I remind you, fire crystals filled with nerve agent toxins on them, will not destroy the walls of a ship. It won't even damage them. No problems with, sudden dramatic venting or anything. But it will shred the ever-living shit out of naval armsmen. The ideal weapon for boarding actions. So, let's conjure up the image of a generalistic naval engagement, shall we? Without getting into too much detail as to the classes involved, as the Dark Eldar prefer one particular strategy over nearly all others, and that is a wave assault. Not in the Soviet style, mind you, of running screaming towards the machine gun and hopefully picking up the guys in front of you's rifle when he dies, but rather a far more well-coordinated and properly executed variant of the wave-style assault. As here, of course, we are in 3D space, not in 2D. The initial stage of any battle with the Drukhari will preferably start with surprise. Now, of course, hiding an entire fleet is going to be rather difficult, particularly as not all of the vessels are likely to be equipped with mimic drives, but there are ways to do so whilst hiding in plain sight. You could, for example, draw the enemy in on what appears to be a smaller and weaker formation before revealing all of the escorts that do have mimic drives to launch the first alpha strike, or utilizing the terrain, quote-unquote, in space terms, like moons or asteroid fields, etc. There's a multitude of ways of doing this, but preferably the Dark Eldar will get the first hit off. This is as much to cause panic amongst the enemy as it is to cause actual damage, and in many cases where there isn't any clever strategies to be employed, the Dark Eldar may instead launch a lengthy period of terror attacks before any overt fleet engagement, raiding shipping lanes and sending the destroyed hulks spinning in towards the system, or with a handful of people on board, tied up to the voxcasters so everybody can hear them scream, or sending torturous vid feeds or recordings to the enemy fleet, trying to freak them out and seeing if they can't get them to do something stupid, or better yet, abandon their posts. After all, whilst, Imperial Navy military personnel would probably fetch a decent price at the markets of Commorragh, again, the Dark Eldar are predators, not warriors. They are here for prey, not fellow hunters. Having achieved surprise, preferably, or some form of distraction, the Dark Eldar will then launch their initial assault. If they can do so from relatively close range, this will be done with Phantom Lancers, aiming at crippling individual vessels of high priority, with the whole fleet focusing their firepower on lead enemy ships, or, if they're able to identify them, centers of command and control. If, for example, an Imperial fleet has been identified as having a single commanding admiral aboard one vessel, then blowing that ship up is going to be the immediate priority. For whilst most civilized races' organization when it comes to naval warfare is usually a strength, it can also always be a weakness to have a hierarchy that's a little bit too rigid. If no such tempting target can be located, then the Drukhari fleet will simply work its way down the priority list, trying to knock out lead vessels in squadrons, or crippling larger or smaller ships in such a way as to try to make them into an impediment and a distraction for their friends. As the Dark Eldar will not necessarily aim to destroy the enemy in the first alpha strike, they will rather aim to throw them into disarray. Not because they wouldn't like to kill them, and if they can, they definitely will, but because when you're shooting at dozens of kilometer-long warships, you're usually not going to be in a position to destroy them all outright. And so, in the Dark Eldar mindset, it is better to confuse them and panic them, and thus make sure that their return fire will be as disorganized and ineffective as possible. This also is where the wave assault tactics come into play. Most Eldar warships are really goddamn fast, and the Drukhari variants are no exception to the rule. Thus, preferably, they will want to close with the enemy as fast and as aggressively as possible. Virtually all Drukhari vessels carry the majority of their weapons in their prows, with only some of the larger ships carrying some flank-mounted batteries of torpedoes or lancers. This is so that they can slice through, under, or over an enemy formation at high speed, whilst delivering their payloads on target. This is particularly worthwhile against Imperials, who often need to place their flanks opposite the enemy to deliver the majority of their firepower. By the time the Imperial battle line has turned, hopefully, the first wave of Drukhari warships will be sweeping over or between them or under them, presenting the Imperials immediately with a second wave of enemies coming in at equally high speeds, also equally so blazing their weapons at the Imperials, giving the enemy a hard choice. Do they turn, pivot, to try and engage the enemies that are trying to pass them, or do they meet head-on the enemy wave that's already incoming? What about the second one? Do they track it? What if there's a third one? Do they turn? Do they expose potentially vulnerable sides of their ships, their underparts, or their tops to the next wave? And what about the first wave? Is it coming about? Etc., etc. In an ideal scenario, the Eldar will be constantly maneuvering around the enemy, launching assault after blistering assault, and only staying within the opposition's own arcs of fire for a minimum amount of time. Again, bear in mind that the primary defense of a Eldar warship, and the Drukhari are no exception, is to not get hit. Not to absorb the hits if they do get hit. And something like a mimic field or a shadow shield, well, again, they mess with the enemy's targeting systems. They'll throw them off, but experienced gunnery crews and augury captains will begin to adjust. If they notice that they're missing by 100 kilometers, well, just put in minus 100 kilometers in the targeting solution. At that point, every miss becomes another data point, and it is only a question of time until bracketing fire turns into hitting fire. And with the fragile construction of Drukhari warships, they're not going to be standing up to that for very long at all. Preferring then the enemy to switch over to a new target and needing them to start up an entirely new set of data gathering parameters to track it and its shadow field, as no two are ever quite 100% the same. So the error on one might be 100 kilometers, on the next it might be 110, on the next after that it might be 113. An ideal engagement for the Drukhari is one in which the enemy will get to fire a whole lot, but not actually hit anything. Easier said than done, of course, but when you have superior weapon systems, superior targeting, and superior speed, it's far from impossible. And presuming they manage to win the Void War, then the important work of invading the planet begins, where the ships will provide not a whole lot of direct support, as their weapons aren't really designed to be bombarding planets, and besides, you'll be ruining all of the good stuff you'll want to steal anyways, but instead they'll act mostly as logistical systems, and obviously as massive platforms for bombers and fighters. Preferably, the Dark Eldar will then launch an extended campaign of terror tactics against the planet, defeating the enemy in detail before they even fire the first shot. And if they are in command of orbit, they'll be able to do so with absolute supremacy. They can invade any point on the planet at any time, bomb any area, strike any outpost, hit any military, or avoid them as required, isolate any village, isolate any town, and pick and choose their targets with perfect precision from the vantage point of the gods they view themselves as. At this point, the planet in question is doomed, and the only real hope of its populace is that they won't be picked up, and that somebody else will instead, until the raiders have filled their holes and simply return back home again, to much applause and general acclaim, no doubt. If you want to hear more about the ground tactics, I would suggest my old video on it, but it's also about 5 years old, and God, I shudder at the stuff I used to produce. The audio quality, God help me. But hey, it's there if you can stomach it. But now, you hopefully have a much better idea of Dark Eldar warships, their weapons, their defensive systems, their tactics, and their roles. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.